We're back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. With the recent media appearance of Christopher Steele, author of the now infamous Steele Dossier, published by BuzzFeed, I believe back in early 2017, the whole story of Fusion GPS, the Clinton campaign's involvement in it, who funded what, but more importantly, the strange and seemingly symbiotic role between the press and private investigative agencies of various kinds is back in the news, which gives me an opportunity to interview someone I've wanted to speak with for a while. Barry Meier is an investigative journalist. He is a Pulitzer finalist with his team on Investigative International reporting. He spent 28 years at the Times covering business, medicine, and the public's health, which is, of course, close to many of the topics the show covers. But the book I've wanted to talk to him about, and I intend to talk to him about, is Spooked. It's his new book, Spooked, The Trump Dossier, Black Cube, and the Rise of Private Spies. So first of all, Barry Meier, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Richard. I very much appreciate you having me on.
Well, thanks for coming. And although it doesn't say so in the books, and by the way, I do encourage people to read the book, and it's very gripping and very informative, although it doesn't say so in the subtitle of the book, I would argue that it's not just private spies, but the relationship between those spies and the profession of journalism that's very much a subject of the book. Is that a fair statement?
Very, very much so. I mean, there's always a debate between writers and publishers over how to title a book, how to subtitle a book. But in many ways, that symbiotic relationship and the transformations in that relationship were central to my decision, one, to write the book, and two, to the focus that I took in my reporting for the book. I mean, it's having been a reporter for almost 4 decades, and have crossed paths with private spies along the way. I was particularly interested in that relationship and how it could turn toxic.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating and to me extremely important topic, and goes far beyond. Although it's a perfect example of the Steele dossier, to me, is Yankelovich, or I think it was a political scientist that Yankelovich, the pollster, quoted many years ago, said, the press can't tell you what to think, but they can tell you what to think about. And, we could debate. Maybe they can kind of shape what you think too. But if we accept the premise that the press still, even in this day and age, has a large influence on what people think about, then the role of private spies as sources of information becomes even more important, doesn't it? Because, with newsrooms cutting back and everything else, if I'm a reporter trying to get my arms around the next story and somebody comes to me with something hot and my editors like it, whether it comes from a private spy or not, there's a good chance it's going to get published. And even if, and I know you give examples where this is not the case, but even if all the information in my story is correct, by the very act of feeding it to me, these private spy agencies have shaped public perception, true, whether the story is true or false. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a situation where, as you mentioned, when you introduced me, there is a symbiotic relationship between journalists and private operatives. And it works simply like this. The private operatives give journalists stories. They feed them information that we as reporters need to stay alive, or think we need to stay alive. And in turn, the operatives get to use reporters to channel that information into the public, to publicize it. And the bonus for them is that they can do it without having their fingerprints on it, without exposing themselves, without having the public realize that this is coming from someone with a dog in the fight. In fact, someone who's being paid to plant this information in the media. And I think, part of the reason why I focus so much on the Steele dossier in the book was to try to get the idea across that we as journalists, and I very much still consider myself a journalist, need to reshape this relationship. We can't allow private operatives to kind of set the rules of engagement. They need us. Ultimately, we don't need them. And so that power relationship has to be changed. And the public has to become aware of the fact that of where this information is coming from. Otherwise, we as intermediaries and supposedly as honest brokers in this process, we're deceiving our readers, we're deceiving our viewers, we're concealing things from them that they really have a right to know.
And, I was fascinated for one of the scenes that comes to mind for me, Barry Meier, is the scene where you described a Tavern Inn in D.C., where I've stayed several times when I used to live further away. Kind of a, informal place, but also a meeting place, where you describe a kind of, and I'd have to look it up to see who exactly was being presented. I don't think it was Steele, but maybe it was Steele. But where it sounded almost. Well, first of all, you describe journalists being brought in groups to meet the source in question. I think you mentioned at one point, good journalists, Mike Isikoff and Jane Meier and somebody else sitting at a table with him. Then another round is brought in. It was kind of like, I don't know, speed dating for journalists
Yes,
and sources.
It was Christopher Steele, and I think I likened in the book to, like, when a movie comes out and the stars are kind of wheeled into a hotel room and they sit there after, as journalists after journalists after journalists after journalists come in and they get the pitch. And this wasn't as extreme as that, but it was basically a kind of show and tell type of situation where, this was arranged by Fusion GPS. And just so your audience is familiar with who they are, this was a firm that was formed by two former Wall Street Journal reporters, Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch. And being, longtime reporters, they know how the game is played. Right. So basically, they bring these, good reporters, good journalists into the room, and lo and behold, who do they find sitting there but Christopher Steele, which, again, many in your audience may have seen photographs of him or him on the recent George Stephanopoulos interview. Nice looking, nice suit, nice hair, nice accent, former MI6 agent. So this kind of guy looks like the real deal and has certainly the resume to suggest he's the real deal. So suddenly, you, reporter, or one as a reporter, are in the, brought in under the veil of secrecy into, this, magical sphere where a guy who supposedly, or you're being told, has spent his life interacting with Russian bad guys is going to share his secrets with you. And it's very, very intoxicating.
The word that comes to mind, Barry, is seduction. And, throughout the decades that you cover in the book, Spooked, seduction, in a way, seems to be an ongoing theme, a kind of seduction of the world of journalism. One of the lines that I noted in the book that I thought was almost thematic for the book was, I may need to get my glasses, excuse me, to read it, was if they did something they would have considered wrong when someone else did it, it wasn't wrong when they did it. That seems to me to almost be like the motto of this entire seductive process. Yeah, we know you shouldn't do this kind of thing, but we're journalists ourselves.
Right. Exactly. I think it's the old story of power and the corrupting nature of power. And and once you become, you know, someone who can have an impact on events or feed journalist stories, and journalists come looking to you for stories, you suddenly assume a position of power. And, within that, you then think, well, I've always been a good guy, or I've always thought of myself as a good guy. So even if this is a little bit dicey, it's all for a good purpose, or there's some noble mission here. One of the striking things, and I still see it, because a lot of people in the mainstream media, which I've spent my career in, still don't want to deal with how they behave during this episode. They're still trying to ignore it, as though they couldn't entertain two separate ideas in their head. One idea, which were both true. One idea is that that the Russians were trying to influence the election, and Donald Trump welcomed that influence. The other idea is that much of the information in the Steele dossier was wrong, and that journalists got played by running with it. And, if we're going to be honest with ourselves and honest professionally, we have to be able to embrace the reality of both those ideas, which are both true.
Right.
And, then kind of draw back and say, okay, well, why did we let this happen? Was there just so much hatred towards Donald Trump, and some of it very understandable, that we were willing to bite on anything that we were fed? And more importantly, by doing so, did we damage our profession? And how do we prevent this from happening again? I mean, ultimately, part of the motivation for me in writing the book was to say to my journalistic colleagues, these rules need to change. We need to wake up. We can't be dragged through this kind of episode again.
Well, Barry Meier, that gets to one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about, and I've talked about this with Matt Taibbi, who's a friend of guests, other guests, and I'm fixated on this. I haven't done that much straight journalism. I've done a little bit, but mostly opinion pieces and so on over the years. But even in an opinion piece, if I cite a fact and it turns out, even if it's a true minor fact in the context of the story, the opinion piece, if it turns out to be wrong, if I say companies' revenues were 12.9 billion, they turn out to be 4.8 billion, whatever it is, and thank God it hasn't happened that much. But when it does happen, I can tell you I'm clinically depressed for at least 3 days. I can't eat, I can't sleep, I hate myself, I can't look at myself in the mirror. And I've always thought that was a fundamental element of the journalistic personality or DNA or makeup, that you got to get it right and you hate yourself if you don't get it right. One of the things that's astonished me about the whole Steele dossier story and the cluster of stories around it is how many journalists got it wrong, really wrong, and got other facts, stated them as facts that are totally unverifiable one way or the other. And yet they seem to go on like, oh, well, stuff happens. And I totally don't get that. I feel like it's a sea change in the journalistic mentality. What do you think?
Well, I obviously, I don't know what the driving force is for it, whether it's generational. I'm old, you're old, or relatively old.
I'm old.
And, I felt feel the same way you do. I hate it when I get something wrong, even if it's minor. However, over the years, I have seen examples of people who have what I would call this carapace. It's a carapace that, they've got this hardened shell around them where they can't do anything wrong. And if they do, it just kind of bounces off of them. It just doesn't penetrate through them, to them. They don't see themselves as having made a mistake. It's somebody else's fault. And that would happen. I'd see people like that along the line. But the frightening thing is that it is happening like ad nauseum now. And it's not only happening within the universe of individual reporters and commentators, it's happening institutionally.
Right.
It's as though it's as if MSNBC or CNN would acknowledge something, would pull back and say, we told you for 3 years about the Steele dossier. We loved it. We thought it was great. We filled all this airtime, blah, 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 but we wheeled out all these people to comment on it, blah, blah, blah. They all were wrong.
Right.
Here's how we got it so wrong. They can't institutionally afford to do that because they know that Fox News, which makes the same sort of errors, probably even more outrageous ones in promoting its particular ideological agenda, would jump down their throat.
Right.
So we've gotten ourselves into this really toxic situation where, I can write a book and have people whose views, for the most part, I find appalling, embrace the book because they see, well, oh, he's right. The media sucks and they got it all wrong, and blah, blah, blah. And people who I would normally think would be I'd have some journalistic camaraderie with, ignore it.
Right.
And kind of turn away their eyes. Don't show us this. We don't want to know about this.
Right.
And it's just, I think it's just, a symptom of the kind of topsy-turvy world that we're living in. And unfortunately, I don't know what's going to break that cycle.
Yeah, and I don't want to oversimplify Barry Meier and say, well, it's partisanship, but it seems to me that partisanship is a piece of it, and that the liberalism I grew up with, truth was a value. It wasn't just, our policy goals were a value. Truth was a value. And I keep thinking about, she's a dear friend and a work colleague, so I sincerely hope she doesn't listen to this, but I keep coming back to a comment a friend of mine made. She was talking about this Steele dossier and things like this. This was long before your book came out, actually. This was in the midst of it, and I wrote a few pieces saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm not sure about this stuff. And I said, it's not true. There's no evidence for it. And her answer to me, Barry, was, yeah, but it's fun. And I think that's a huge piece of it. It's partisan fun. Don't you?
Well, if it was just fun, it would have been forgotten about because, how long can you joke about P-tapes?
Yeah.
And Steve Colbert had a lot of fun with that. But it became something else, I'm afraid, for lots of journalists. It became, their talking points.
Yeah.
It became an easy talking point, a way of, showing their colors and still pretending to be nonpartisan journalists because they could just refer to this, or maybe it's true, or it hasn't been proven untrue, or whatever the case may be. And I don't think, sadly, there's ever going to be an accounting for that behavior. And what worries me is that, we now have this behavior has been institutionalized and these people have been empowered. And in the same way that, people say it's not wrong, it's wrong when other people are doing it, but when I'm doing it, it's okay. This has become sort of the journalistic equivalent of that. Yeah, you can correct your mistakes, but I don't need to. I've gotten away with mine. And so I just feel we've ended up in a bad place And not to take exception with George Stephanopoulos, who I don't know and wouldn't have otherwise watched. And I did not watch the entire interview with Christopher Steele, but simply to, you know, to, get a little ratings goose for his new production company
Yeah.
by getting an interview with Christopher Steele without doing a really thorough autopsy on the dossier and the people involved in the dossier, and bringing to light or letting readers know that most of the people that worked with Christopher Steele don't want to talk about him, right? They don't want to talk about him. So, it's fine to have him up there saying, well, yeah, maybe Michael Cohen went to Prague, and maybe, I think he probably did. And then you could say, well, the
Right, sure.
allowing that sort of equivocation and without taking it apart is, to me, it's not journalism.
No, it's not, and it feeds it. I mean, you know better than I, but it doesn't seem to me to be, and it seems to feed into where there's smoke, there's fire. That's the kind of mentality you.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the consumer mentality. Well, there must be something to it. Which,
yeah,
I don't know. Would you guys apply that same logic to Sacco and Vanzetti? I mean, it's like there's a preposterousness to it, and yet that seems to be the logic. And one of the things, by the way, speaking of like kind of stepping outside the partisan frame here, one of the things that struck me too in your book is that it seems as if the Clinton campaign, the first Clinton campaign, pioneered this technique of hiding the work of investigators by having, which of course is what happened with Fusion GPS, by having their law firm hire the investigator, and then it becomes protected by attorney-client privilege, and the dollars aren't conspicuously visible in the campaign accounts, so it kind of buries that in a public disclosure. That was actually a technique pioneered by the Bill Clinton presidential campaign, wasn't it?
Indeed. And interestingly enough, Mike Isikoff, who would many years later write about Christopher Steele and subsequently disown Christopher Steele, to his credit, broke that story when he was at the Washington Post, when he discovered that private investigators were being hired to, dig up dirt on women who were claiming that they had a relationship with Bill Clinton. But he couldn't find like any of those records in FEC filings. Like, where's the money coming from? Who's paying these folks? And he realized that the money was being effectively laundered through a law firm, which was then paying the investigator, which it technically had hired to work on behalf of the campaign. And that's become the standard of operation. That's why Fusion GPS's, the Clinton campaign's Fusion payments to Fusion GPS did not show up on FEC filings because they didn't pay them directly. They paid Perkins Coie, the law firm that worked for them. And in turn, Perkins Coie paid Fusion. And so, that relationship has a double-barrel value to this clandestine world. One is to conceal the payments, and two is to create this, attorney-client or attorney work product privilege, which technically can be argued by lawyers in court to prevent the disclosure of this information in case litigation emerges. It's interesting, though, because there's a lawsuit right now related to the dossier that was filed by this Russian financial institution, Alpha Bank, against Fusion GPS, where this question of work product privilege is very much on the front burner. And it is a litigation where Fusion's communications with journalists about the dossier and other matters could become public, and that's going to be a field day for the right wing media.
Yeah, that's the kind of part of the tragedy of this, Tommy. And by the way, I assume that's the case where there were stories suggesting that somehow Trump's campaign servers were mysteriously communicating with a Russian bank's servers, and there was this proof of this shocking James Bondish espionage when there was nothing to it. Is the case?
It is. I mean, not to get too deeply in the weeds, it both is and isn't the case, simply because the pinging story is what is what it was called.
Yeah, the pinging, right?
Pinging between these computers was not ever mentioned in the dossier.
I see.
But Christopher Steele, once Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS and Michael Sussman, the attorney at Perkins Coie, who was recently indicted by John Durham, the special prosecutor, started shopping that information to the media, that story to the media. Glenn Simpson asked Christopher Steele to investigate relationships between the Alpha Bank oligarchs and the Kremlin. So they're tied up together. The specific allegations of pinging aren't associated with it, but had that whole pinging story not come up, Fusion could have saved itself a lot of legal fees at this point.
Interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating. And by the way, the book, for people who don't know it, again, my guest is Barry Meier, and the book is, I haven't memorized as a subtitle, Barry, Spooked, the Trump Dossier, Black Cube, and the Rise of Private Spies, has a number of stories. We've talked about, different clients, principality or something in the United Arab Emirates, and of course in the former Soviet bloc, people bringing in these firms. And I think you say somewhere in it that while there are no, because so many firms are privately held, there are no clear figures on the total scope of this industry. It's estimated around 2.5 billion a year, which may sound like small change in contrast to, I don't know, oil companies or something. Right. It's still, when you're talking about a human information business, right, it's a lot of money, right?
It's a lot of money. And let's not forget that doesn't take in account for, something I didn't dwell on too much in the book, which is the whole clandestine side of this industry in terms of hacking and right, the illegal gathering.
Where these firms might hire somebody to give them, even themselves, an arm's distance from the...
maybe a daisy chain of people.
Yeah.
And there often is a daisy chain of people between the client who wants the information or implies they want sensitive information and the company or individual who many steps down the way undertake right, the activity to gather that information. So there's a right, lot of liability.
A kind of a Lucky Luciano defense. I just make this happen.
Who knew? I'd like to know what does he say when he talks to people?
Yeah.
People.
Yeah. I mean, if you could arrange that for me,
yeah. What?
Right. Yeah, listen, before I let you go, Barry Meier, you also, I do want to at least mention the Black Cube dimension of this, because, there are always going to be people who think, well, whatever they did to hurt Trump is okay with me, which I think is a deeply misguided view. But there will be people who say that. And to them, I would also say, well, Black Cube, the Israeli investigative firm, they're the folks who helped Harvey Weinstein smear the reputations. Correct me if I'm wrong, but smear the reputations of his victims, thereby allowing him to continue to victimize others. So the evil of that would hopefully be uncontroversial. I don't know if you want to say a couple words about that before.
Well, I think what you have to realize, or folks need to realize, and it certainly became clear to me when I was working on the book is that, these folks are soldiers of fortune.
Right.
They're guns for hire. So even if you think, well, Fusion GPS, these are good guys, they went after Donald Trump, blah, blah. Well, just before that, they were working for Theranos, and they were monitoring a former colleague of theirs at the Wall Street Journal who was trying to uncover the fraud at Theranos. And they were working for this Russian real estate firm that was at loggerheads with Bill Browder, the investor who, lobbied to get the Magnitsky Act passed. So, and I don't mean Fusion specifically, but, there's no loyalty. These folks have no loyalties. They have no, for the most part, they don't say, I'm not going to work for Russians, or I'm not going to work for, Saudis, or for MBS, or from whomever. They take the jobs that come their way because they know if they don't, someone else will.
Yeah. And if you had, one concluding thought, or, after 2 years of working on this book, one moral takeaway or emotional takeaway, did it shift your perspective? Did it disillusion you? Did it, how did this affect you? And when you finally were done with this thing, how did you feel?
Apart from wanting to take a shower,
Uh-huh.
I think one of the lines that's in the book that sort of stuck with me, and that is, these folks see us as marks, like in a 3-card Monte game. We're the suckers, and we're the ones who they want to play, and they're all different ways and techniques they have to try to win our confidence, and to, it's almost like, the kind of spam that you get that are really phishing emails.
Right.
But this is being done on a more direct human level. And I would just say to your audience, like, if a stranger approaches you bearing gifts or trying to become your friend, be aware that the issue they're approaching you about may not be the issue they're really interested in. They may just be stroking you, trying to, get past your immediate defenses. And then for, my friends in journalism, my colleagues in journalism, I guess the big takeaway there, and I've had the good fortune of speaking to some newsrooms about this, is that we really need to change. This game has to stop. We can't be participants in it. And we have to rid our profession of this malign influence.
Well, that's, if there's one takeaway I want my audience to get from this conversation, that is it. So I strongly encourage people to read the book. Again, the book is Spooked, The Trump Dossier, Black Cube, and the Rise of Private Spies. My guest has been its author, Barry Meier. Barry, thanks so much for writing this book, and thanks for coming on the program.
I really appreciate your having me. Thank you.
You bet. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.